Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be going over the Roland 510, which is part of their System-500 series modules in Eurorack. So Roland was kind enough to send me some of their new System-500 modules, which are these black ones here. So I'm going to be doing a bunch of videos for that, starting with the 510 in this video. So if you're not familiar with the System-500, it's a new set of all analog modules that Roland's coming out with, and they're all heavily inspired by the classic Roland 700 system and the 100M. So Roland actually used to make modulars back in the 70s and 80s, and these new ones are based in Eurorack, and they're kind of inspired by that world. So the 510 is based on the 110 from the System 100M, and it's effectively 3 modules in one. You get a VCO, a VCF, and a VCA. So you can think of it either as a kind of a single voice module, and like a mini self-contained synth, or as 3 independent modules, because you can patch out at all the different points and treat the modules as completely independent if you wanted to. The filter is a 24 dB low-pass filter, and there's actually 2 high-pass or 2 choices of high-pass filter frequencies that you can also add in if you wanted to. And the filter self-oscillates, so if you crank the resonance up, you can play the filter. So let's go over the front panel real quick. It's the module here in the middle. You can see it's divided into 3 sections. The first section is your oscillator, then your filter, and then the VCA. So let's start off with the VCO, the oscillator. On top here, you have different waveform outputs. So you have a square wave, a triangle wave, and a sawtooth wave. In the middle here, you have pulse width control over the pulse wave, and you have pulse width modulation by hand. And then you have pulse width modulation via some external source, which you can attenuate with this knob here. Down here, you have your standard oscillator range control. So you have your 2-foot to 32-foot switch. And then you have your fine-tune control, so you can tune it. Down here, you have 2 modulation inputs, one called key, which is your volt per octave control. And this is how you can control pitch if you plug in a keyboard or sequencer or something. And then you have a second mod input here, which you can control the level of here. So you can add effects like vibrato. All right, so what I'm going to do is patch the oscillator outputs directly into my interface so you can hear the raw, pure oscillator with no filter and no effects. So I'm going to plug that in, bring the volume. That's a square wave, here's a triangle, and here's a sawtooth. Nice and chunky sounds. Let's go back to the square wave because we'll play around with the pulse width modulation. So I can modulate the pulse width by hand. And to demonstrate the pulse width modulation via some CV signal, I'm going to set it back to 50%. And I'm going to patch an LFO here, let's say a sine wave LFO, into the pulse width control. Then we can play with the range knob here to see the range of the full oscillator, all the way down to 32. Get these really thick sounds. Going up to 16. And now we're at 2-foot. And of course you have your fine-tune control here. All right, let's move over to the triangle wave. I'm going to remove the pulse width control so you can get a feel for that tone. I noticed there's this little bleepy sound every time you change the octave range. I'm not sure if that's a quirk of the analog design or... So it might not be great to perform this live. It might be good to set your range and leave it be. Moving over to the sawtooth. These really nice thick analog sounds. So again, I'm going to patch in an LFO. We can grab a sample and hold. And of course, there's a key input here, which is our volt per octave control. So I'm going to feed a quick sequencer through a quantizer to get some melodic notes. An LFO into the pitch control here to add some vibrato. Right, so that covers the basics of the oscillator. Next to that, we have the filter. So by default, the square wave goes through the filter goes through the VCA, and then you go output. So even with patching nothing in terms of the signal flow, you can still get an oscillator filter VCA signal path. All right, so let's go over the front panel of the filter here. So at the top, we have 2 signal inputs. So you can feed 2 oscillators or a drum machine or a sampler or anything. Then you have your sliders to control the amount of the signals. And then down here, you have your standard cutoff frequency and resonance controls. Below that, you have the output. So this is the output from the filter directly. And this is how you can sort of extract this module to use it independently. If you don't use this output, then it'll automatically go through the VCA, and then you can get your main outs here, which we'll cover later. And at the bottom here, you have 2 CV controls of the cutoff frequency, one labeled key and one standard one. The key one is similar to the oscillator one. It's a volt per octave, so you can play melodic sequences, and you can use the filter as an oscillator by cranking the resonance up into self-oscillation. And then the second one you can use as standard filter controls. All right, so let's see what the filter sounds like. I'm just going to patch the raw output of the filter straight into my audio interface, and I'm not going to patch anything into the inputs, because remember, the square wave gets patched automatically through the first input. So I'm going to crank the volume up so that we get the square wave going through, crank the output, and then we can play with the cutoff frequency. Just to show you guys the range. Set the resonance at 50%. Nice smooth control. Bring resonance up. Self-oscillation. You get this really gnarly, kind of angry filter sound. And then at the bottom here, you have a switch for a high-pass filter. So there's an optional high-pass filter that you can run through. You don't have independent control over the cutoff frequency, but you have 2 choices, 1 and 2, which are just 2 predefined sets of cutoff frequencies. So let's see what that sounds like. This is switch 1 and switch 2. So you can really thin out the sound. Effectively, you're creating a bandpass filter. All right, so that's the basics of the filter. So let's play around with some of the modulation outputs here. So let's patch our trusty LFO through the second mod source here and crank that up. Or we can patch our sample and hold input into the cutoff frequency control. Get those classic. And of course, I can break the normal control by patching a separate oscillator or a different oscillator into the filter here. So let's patch in the square wave, or sorry, the Sawtooth wave, so we get more harmonics to play with. And of course, I can patch my Sawtooth into the second input, so we get a mix of the square and saw. Or we can add a triangle. And just to make things more fun, I'm going to patch that same sample and hold through my quantizer, and then we're going to change the frequency of the oscillator to get a melody, a quantized melody. Or I can patch a sequencer output. All right, so far we've covered the oscillator, the filter, and finally we have the VCA here, which we're going to cover now. So let's go over the front panel like we did before. So again, you have two signal inputs. So you can feed any two signals here, oscillators, drum machines, any audio. Then you have your volume knobs or attenuators for those signals. Down here you have linear and exponential switch to change how the VCA responds. You have your initial gain setting. You have two outputs, low and high. So you can use one to interface with modular level audio or with external gear. And finally, you have your standard CV controls. You have two CV inputs, each with their own attenuators. Oh, and again, the first signal here is normal to the output of the filter of this module. Basically, what this means is if you don't put anything in the patch here, by default, you'll get the output of the filter coming in here, so you can add that in. So you don't have to waste a patch cable for that. All right, so let's create a very simple patch using an ADSR envelope generator with the peaks here to control the volume of the sound. So we're going to be getting the square wave coming through the filter. The volume is all the way up here. Frequency is all the way up. And then the output will automatically go here. So we're going to raise this volume. I'm going to set it into linear mode, reduce the input gain. And then I'm going to grab the output of my envelope generator into my audio interface. So right now we're not hearing anything because everything is, the volume is all the way down. So I can increase the initial gain here. So you can hear when we remove the filter. So if you set the initial gain to 0, effectively the volume's all the way down by default. So it's waiting for you to send a control signal to alter that volume. So just as demonstration purposes, I'm going to patch my LFO square wave directly as a CV control. So you're going to hear what it sounds like without an envelope generator. The square wave basically just goes on, off. So we're going to hear the sound coming in and out. So if I plug this here and increase the modulation amount. So you can hear this LFO is directly controlling the volume of the sound here. So of course you can patch like a sine wave or something. Or Sawtooth. But one more interesting thing you can do is I'm going to treat the square wave as a clock or as a gate generator. And I'm going to trigger the envelope generator here. And now if I patch that envelope generator into my VCA here. So now we're getting the same thing because I've set my ADSR to low attack, low decay, full sustain, and no release. So effectively we're mimicking a gate signal. But now you can decrease the attack time so you can get things like sloping. So let me just plug that in and demo the changes. Decrease the release time so we get more tail. Or you can create plucky sounds by decreasing the sustain and adding some decay and a bit of release to make it echo a little bit. Oh, another thing I forgot to mention is that the mod input 1 of the VCA is normal to the mod input 2 of the filter. So if I patch my ADSR into the second CV input of the filter to control the cutoff frequency, it will automatically also control the VCA. So you can find this typically in fixed architecture synths where you normally share one envelope generator to control both the cutoff frequency and the volume. So let's patch that in. So now you can hear the filters opening and the volume is going up at the same time. I'm going to put the filter into self-oscillation by cranking the resonance up. And then the same signal we've been using to control our oscillator frequency, I'm just going to patch it into the filter and then increase that amount and go into self-oscillation. So you can see All right, so I'm going to leave it there for now. Hopefully this gives you a good idea of the general range and types of sound you get out of this and what the knobs and sliders all do here. To recap, it's effectively 3 modules in one. So you get a filter, an oscillator, and VCA all built in. You can treat them all independently, or you can treat this as kind of a single voice module. So if you don't have much real estate, this is only 20 HP, and you just want to add kind of a full synth voice, this is a great way to do it as well. If you like this kind of stuff, make sure to subscribe, like, share it with your grandma, and I'll see you guys in the next one.